My name is Shawna Burns, and I'm a licensed professional counselor and a licensed alcohol and drug abuse counselor. And I'm so grateful for the opportunity to share this violence prevention and seed digging training with you. Seed digging really is based on a simple concept that all of us have a beautiful garden inside of our heart, and in that garden sometimes weeds and flowers grow. And weeds represent those actions, those behaviors that cause problems for others and ourselves, and the flowers represent those behaviors that bring life and bring joy. And when we know who we are and we have positive thoughts and beliefs about ourselves, just like Maslow says, then these little tiny seeds get planted, and in turn they will grow and they will thrive. And so the goal of seed digging is to help children begin to see themselves through a lens of love and to realize that they are not their actions, they are not the weeds or the behaviors that cause problems for their life. They are the garden, and they are worthy of love and acceptance, and that they can learn, grow, and thrive at their greatest potential. During this training, we are going to talk about some stories to help you understand how emotional and behavioral disorders develop in ways that we can help children overcome them and heal. When I share the stories, sometimes it brings emotions with the stories, and shame and guilt sometimes tries to tell us that we should have done this, or I can't believe I said that or did this. I want to encourage you not to listen to shame or guilt during this training, because as Maya Angelou says, we really do the best we can with what we have at the time. When we know better, we do better. And so this training is meant to encourage you, to equip you, and to once again help you see the world and help you to see others through the eyes of love and acceptance. I hope you enjoy. Today we're going to talk about violence prevention. What drives a child or even an adult to have violent tendencies or to even commit violent acts? I think one of the most important things that we can remember when we are talking about violence prevention is I don't believe that it really has to be rocket science. I think when you begin to understand what goes on behind the scenes in the mind of a child who is struggling, and many times that means they're struggling because of trauma or different events that have happened to them in their life, when you begin to understand what goes on behind the scenes, it really does give a different picture. So today what I want to do is I want to help break down what goes on behind the scenes in the mind of a child and help you understand how emotional and behavioral disorders and addictions develop. And once they develop, how they can begin to turn into behaviors and really not only cause harm for others, but also harm for oneself. When you look up the causes, the root causes of violence, there are several things that science has found that has strong correlations. We know that mental health conditions can definitely be correlated to violent tendencies. We know that there's definitely a correlation there. Addictions are also things that can cause violent tendencies. We know that when the brain is altered with a substance, there can be some pretty horrible things that can happen. Environmental stressors. We see that many times with those who have been exposed to violence and those who have maybe been raised in a home with domestic violence or abuse. We also know that biological factors and epigenetics can be correlated to someone who struggles with violent tendencies. One research study that came out actually measured stress and cortisol levels of those who had grandparents or great-grandparents, I believe even parents, who were in the Holocaust. And even though that child or that grandchild had never been actually in the Holocaust or were in the war, when they studied the amount of stress and cortisol levels in that child's body and in their brain, they found that there was a significant higher amount than those of their peers who did not have a grandparent or a parent or a great-grandparent who survived the Holocaust. So we know that children can be predisposed and can actually have higher levels of cortisol. And in my mind, I think of it like an engine, right? Some children, some people just have their brain runs faster. It's like they have a Ferrari brain. Their brain goes so fast all of the time, and that's something that we can begin to see struggles with because their brain is just wired very fast. And the side effect of that is anxiety. That is very common with our students who have very fast brains, or basically they have high cortisol levels that are constantly running. So that's one thing that we know has a significant correlation. We know that a lack of connection can also cause significant issues with both violence, depression, anxiety, and even suicidal tendencies, because humans were not meant to be alone. Daniel Siegel has phenomenal information on this and excellent research, and he says that humans cannot grow without connection. Some examples that I think of when I think of a lack of connection, one is the movie Castaway with Tom Hanks. And those of you who have seen the movie may remember that he's on a deserted island and he's all alone. And I believe it's a volleyball that washes up on shore, and he puts a face on it and he calls the volleyball Wilson. And that's a perfect example of how humans were not meant to be alone. An interesting side note is when I work with those who struggle with hallucinations or struggle with personality issues or even DID, I commonly find that the hallucination is actually the way that the brain created a friend or something to help the person not feel alone. So one of the things we find, once again, is that a lack of connection can cause serious emotional and behavioral distress, which can definitely lead to behavioral or emotional disorders. Another root cause of violence is a history of trauma. We know that students who have a history of trauma, and not only trauma, but abuse, can be a definite link and a correlation to violence. And let me back up and also say that we have to remember that trauma is subjective. The word trauma, I think 20 years ago, had a different meaning to most of us probably than what we see now. But we have to understand that trauma to a young child who has lost his puppy dog, which may have been his best friend, that trauma to that child could be a level 10. The pain level could be, out of just extreme. How can we compare that child's pain to a grown man on the battlefield who maybe lost his best friend? So once again, we have to remember that trauma is subjective. I work with children and adults who had early trauma from moving schools multiple times throughout the years and not being able to say goodbye to friends. Trauma can be caused from anesthesia. My daughter had 3 surgeries before she was 2, and anesthesia on a young child can cause side effects like panic attacks. It can cause side effects such as night terrors. We struggled with night terrors when she was little, and we no longer struggle with those, but that is a common side effect that we see from anesthesia when a child is young. So once again, we have to remember that trauma is subjective. However, we do know that abuse and neglect is correlated with root causes of violence and, once again, suicidal tendencies or depression and anxiety. One of the things I want to say, though, that I have consistently seen over the past 17 years of being a mental health counselor is that at the root of every child and adult who I've ever worked with who struggles with an emotional or behavioral disorder or an addiction, there is one common denominator that I see, and that is that they are missing an innate need. And Maslow talks about these innate needs that humans have to have really to survive on planet Earth. We have to know that we are loved, valued, needed, accepted, that we belong, that we're safe, and that we're secure. And when we do not have those needs met to the point of helplessness, we can very quickly begin to search and do whatever we have to do to get those needs met. And sometimes those coping skills that we grab onto can lead to destructive behaviors, not only externally, but also inwardly. So a couple of things to keep in mind is the concept of physical survival and emotional survival. And I'm going to break this down so that you can begin to see how really emotional survival, not having one of those 7 and 8 needs met or a lacking of the need to the point of helplessness, really mimics physical survival. So an example of this would be if a person does not have oxygen and maybe they're drowning in a pool of water. So we know that on planet Earth, my body has to have food, water, oxygen. There are certain things that I have to stay alive. And when my body or my brain determines that one of those food, water, oxygen, there's something missing that puts my life in danger, I will go into what's called survival mode. And we're going to talk a little bit more about that later, about how the brain will actually go to the downstairs brain, as Daniel Siegel calls it. It will actually go into the animal reptilian brain just to help the person stay alive. So an example would be if a person's drowning in a pool of water and they're trying to get to the surface and they don't have oxygen in their lungs, they may pull everything and everyone down with them in an attempt to simply get air, get oxygen in their lungs to stay alive. Is that person bad for that? You see, human beings were made to fight to stay alive. I think we would all agree that when a person, if they were drowning in a pool of water, they're going to do whatever they have to survive. That's just, once again, that's survival. And see, you have to understand that emotional survival works the same way. When a human does not feel loved or valued or needed, accepted, that they belong, that they're safe and secure, they can also very quickly go into survival mode. Let me give you an example with our young teenagers, our teenage population. And I typically see this often with the teenage girls who I work with. You know, think for a moment about that concept, loved. When a child doesn't feel loved, or maybe something has happened and for some reason that innate need, they struggle with getting that need met. And we're going to use the example of maybe a young lady doesn't have her daddy needs met, or maybe a mom wasn't there. When that need is not met, it's almost like that young lady will start swimming. She will start doing whatever she has to do to get that need met. You see, humans will connect to something. Sometimes the things we connect with aren't necessarily healthy. So that young lady, she starts, desperately looking for love, and she grabs onto a guy. And all of a sudden she feels like she's queen of the world. She's loved. She's so special. And she gets that need met temporarily. But what happens when that boy dumps her and doesn't want her anymore? Well, we begin to see that same pattern evolve. All of a sudden she starts swimming again, and what does she do? She grabs onto another guy. And that's a coping skill. She temporarily gets that need met. She feels loved and special. But what happens when he dumps her? And the cycle continues on and on and on. And she continuously grabs at relationships, that sometimes very unhealthy relationships, just to get that need met. And that many times is when mental health therapists will see these young teenagers, is when now they feel more devalued and less loved than they ever did in the beginning. All because that innate need was lacking. Another example is think about your teenagers who struggle with gangs. Years ago, I worked in a school who had several students who were involved in gangs. And that belonging need, one of those 7 and 8 needs, that belonging need was what was lacking and missing. Think about your children who never had a family, or maybe they were neglected, or they didn't get those needs met. Think about your teenage boys who all of a sudden find a group of guys who make them feel important and that they matter and that they have a family. And he gets that belonging need met, but not in the most healthy ways. So he's finally found his family, he feels good, but then that family, that gang, tells him that in order to stay a part of that family, he's going to have to rob that bank or shoot that other gang member because they're a threat to us. And that young man is left with a dilemma. Do I do these horrible things that I don't want to do, and risk the chance of having my family taken from me? Or do I do that because I can't stand the thought of not having my family with me? How many times do we see our young men fall prey to gang violence simply because they have a lacking innate need? Once again, the human mind, the human body, every part of our being has to have those innate needs met. And if we get to the place of hopelessness, sometimes we begin to see some pretty ugly behaviors. But at the root of that child, at the heart of that person, really is a child who needs to be loved, who wants to be loved, accepted, and who wants to love others. I'll give you an example about a young man several years ago at our clinic who was about 4 or 5 years old, and he was having breakdowns and meltdowns in the clinic. He was screaming and cursing anybody in the waiting room that he could find to curse at. He went to the bathroom, was pulling pictures off the wall, water was splashing everywhere. He was having an absolute meltdown. Now, if you pause for a second, it's so easy to judge that young man from the outside looking in and think, this child, he just needs some serious discipline. Now, we'll talk a little bit later about discipline, because children do need discipline and consequences. That's very important. But what was going on behind the scenes with that young man? A few days later, that little boy was able to share with the therapist what went on that day. Now, in that moment, he wasn't able to share what was going on that day because he was in the lower part of his brain. He was in the animal brain, and he was in fight, flight, or freeze mode. You see, he wasn't thinking clearly, because when you're in survival mode, this part of your brain will hijack the higher level thinking part of the brain, and it will take over, because that's how we were made, to stay alive. The little boy told the therapist that day he looked down the hallway and he saw the man with the ponytail, which was our doctor, and he said the doctor, that man with the ponytail, reminded him of the man who abused him. And so what did he do? Fight, flight, or freeze. In his mind, he thought, I have to fight for my life. I will do whatever I have to do before I will be abused again. You see, once again, at the core, behind the scenes, of every emotional struggle or battle, there's always a reason. If you could get to the heart, if you could get behind the scenes and understand that our students who struggle with violent tendencies and violent behaviors, they didn't get there overnight. They didn't just wake up one day and decide to go into a school and shoot other students in the school. But you see, that seed was planted, and over time, as it was watered with trauma and other events of maybe abuse or neglect or horrible situations that happened in life, eventually that seed turns into a giant oak tree. Once again, an oak tree doesn't become an oak tree overnight. These students who are struggling with violent behaviors didn't get there overnight. In order for us to help these students, we have to begin to break this down. We have to begin to pause and look behind the scenes. And we have to see the garden and understand that those weeds can be pulled out, but sometimes we have to get back to the basics. If a person does not have oxygen, they need oxygen. If a person doesn't have electrolytes, they need electrolytes. When a human being or a child doesn't have the emotional needs met inside, we have to be creative and find ways to sow those seeds into that child's heart in order to help that child get to level 4 on Maslow's hierarchy of needs and learn, grow, and thrive at their greatest potential. So let's talk a moment about how those seeds get planted in the heart of a child, really in the heart of an adult as well. You see, when we begin to understand that the mind really does work like a garden, it really begins to, I believe it begins to help us make sense of mental health conditions and really helps us understand that it's not rocket science. If we walked out to a garden and it was overgrown with weeds, it can feel so overwhelming. Where do we even start? But when we begin to break down at the root of these serious emotional and behavioral struggles and violent tendencies and also suicidal tendencies and behaviors, once again, you will find a lacking of the 7 innate needs. So imagine for a second that you have this beautiful garden inside of your heart. And in that garden, weeds and flowers grow. And the weeds represent those behaviors, those things that we do that either cause problems for others or maybe even problems for ourselves. And the flowers represent those things that bring joy and happiness to others or to ourselves. And the weeds and flowers all start from tiny seeds that get planted when we believe things true or false about our lives. When we believe things true about our life, such as the 7 innate needs, which, by the way, every cognitive distortion, negative belief that I find will wrap around one of those 7 innate needs. And we'll talk about later how to target that, because sometimes you just have to target them all through words and strategies. But when you begin to understand that at the root of these weeds or these negative behaviors, you'll find one of the missing 7 innate needs, or a distortion or a variation of that. So once again, when a person believes that they are bad or worthless, that no one loves them, tiny seed gets planted. Now think about the last time that maybe you felt that no one cared about you, or maybe you had a really bad day and someone said something mean to you. You know, we're all human. We've all had those experiences. When the sad seed gets planted, when that thought tells me that no one cares, how do I begin to feel? You know, think about your body for a second. When I have had those moments in life where I felt that no one cared, then all of a sudden a feeling will be developed. So think about the seed getting planted and it's beginning to sprout. So all of a sudden I feel like no one cares about me, and then I begin to feel sad or, you know, heavy, maybe a heaviness in my shoulder, a tightness in my chest. So if you'll pause for a second and think about that, it's really important, because this is one of the strategies that we use to train students about how to start pulling those sad seeds from their heart. Pay attention to your body. It's actually talking to you. So think about that again. When you've had that thought that maybe no one cares or no one's there for you, how do you feel in your body? And then from that emotion or that feeling, imagining it sprouting up, what's the next thing that happens? You know, when I feel that no one cares, I feel sad, and, you know, maybe I don't want to be around people. Maybe it causes me to withdraw and just not go around people, or just stay to myself. That's one weed that is developed from that sad seed. Think about our students who have violent tendencies. Maybe when they don't feel that anyone cares about them, how does that make them feel? Maybe they start feeling heavy and angry. Maybe they get frustrated. And when they get angry or frustrated, how does that come out of their hands, of their mouth, of their feet, right? I've worked with a lot of students who become explosive because they've seen that behavior at home, so it's kind of, that's what they choose and that's how they behave, because they've seen it. So once again, when sad seeds get planted, those negative beliefs get planted in our heart and we believe them, there will be an outcome. There will be a negative feeling attached and usually a behavior. Now the opposite is true. When a happy seed is planted, when we believe positive things about ourselves, that we're loved and that we're valued and that we matter and that we belong, then all of a sudden there's a different emotional response. When I think about those moments in my life where I feel accepted and that I'm loved and valued, I feel warmth in my heart, in my chest, right? I may feel joyful. Think about that for a second. When you feel loved and special, or maybe someone's done really something awesome for you, where do you feel that in your body? When we feel that sensation in our body, right, when we have that positive emotion, then we will have a behavior. A flower will follow. When I feel good inside, I'm a hugger. When I feel loved and warmed and special, I'm a hugger. That's my love language. And so the behavior is I may give lots of hugs. So think about how you respond when you have happy seeds in your heart and in your life. Students, their mind, the garden of their heart works the exact same way. So once again, when we begin to break this down and understand that those weeds in that child's garden, the behaviors, the anger, the frustration, the negative talking mean to other people, or maybe even being mean to themselves, when we begin to understand the root cause, it really makes it so much more manageable and really gives us the ability to pull those sad seeds out and change thoughts within the mind. So if you can take a moment, and I would like you to pull out the student application activity, and we're gonna work on question number 1. So teachers, think for a second about a student that was really tough. Think about all of the behaviors that made that student tough. Maybe they were hard to teach. Maybe they were hard to be around because they were disrespectful. Maybe they said things that, just weren't kind. And leaders, parents, think about maybe your own child or someone that you've worked with that was just really tough to handle and maybe sometimes tough to be around. I would like you to look at number 1 and choose one or more of the following weeds or negative behaviors and list them on the lines labeled number 1 next to your student. So if you take the stick figure and you'll look at number 1, there are weeds listed. I would like you to take a moment to see those negative behaviors and see how they affected that person's life. And you can just list them on number 1. And you may even think of other behaviors that are not listed on the student application activity.